Welcome to Ghostmire, where every night a new horror story drags you deeper than the last. Before anything else, hit subscribe right now. If you miss even one night, you'll miss the piece that connects all these stories into something far darker. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know exactly who's awake inside the dark with us. And listen carefully. This story has something hidden. A moment so disturbing, so unexpected that most people don't recognize it until the very end. If you leave early, you'll never know what really happened. So stay with me, all the way to the final second. Story 1, The Road That Erased Memory. Kyle Anderson had been driving cross-country routes for 12 years when he accepted a contract in April 2021 that would change everything. The pickup was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, destination Portland, Oregon, standard freight, nothing unusual. He loaded up and headed west on I-40, planning to make good time through the night. Around 2:30 a.m., somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, Kyle noticed something odd. The mile markers were counting backwards, 146, 145, 144. He rubbed his eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks. But no, they were definitely going in reverse. His GPS showed him moving forward, making progress, but the physical markers on the highway told a different story. Kyle's CB radio crackled with a voice he didn't recognize. "Driver in the blue Kenworth, you need to turn around." Kyle picked up his mic. "Say again?" The voice responded immediately. "The highway that takes your memory. Every mile you drive, you lose something." Kyle laughed nervously. Some trucker playing games, probably. He continued forward, but 15 minutes later, he couldn't remember what he was hauling. He pulled up his manifest on his tablet, read it. Electronics and auto parts. Of course. How had he forgotten? He'd loaded it himself just hours ago. Except when he tried to picture the loading process, his mind was blank. Another 15 minutes and Kyle couldn't remember his dispatcher's name. He knew he had a dispatcher, knew he'd worked with the same person for years, but the name was just gone, like it had been deleted from his brain. Kyle's hands started shaking. He tried to remember his wife's name, nothing. He knew he was married, could feel the ring on his finger, but her name, her face, everything about her had vanished. Kyle pulled over, gasping for air. He grabbed his phone, looked at his contacts. Names he didn't recognize. Photos of people who should mean something but didn't. His photo gallery showed a woman and 2 children in countless pictures with him. All of them smiling. Clearly his family, but they were strangers. Complete strangers. The CB crackled again. "I warned you. The road takes memory. Every mile is a year of your life, gone forever. I've been driving this stretch for 3 days. I can't remember my childhood, my parents, where I grew up." Kyle keyed his mic with trembling hands. "How do I stop it?" Silence then. "You don't. The road keeps what it takes. I'm warning others now because it's the only thing I remember to do. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know where I'm going." Kyle looked at his GPS. He could turn around, head back the way he came, but which way was that? He couldn't remember the last town he'd passed through. Couldn't remember starting this trip. He checked his logbook, saw entries in his own handwriting that meant nothing to him. Dates. Locations, all meaningless. He drove forward because he didn't know what else to do. The mile markers continued backwards. 87, 86, 85. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Kyle, it's Mom. You didn't call on my birthday." Kyle listened to the voice of a woman he should know, but didn't. "I'm sorry," he said. The woman started crying. "Kyle, what's wrong?" "It's Mom." Kyle felt nothing. No recognition, no emotional connection. Just a stranger's voice. He hung up. The phone rang again immediately. He turned it off. In his mirrors, Kyle saw other trucks behind him, all driving in perfect formation, all on the same road that erased memory. Kyle drove through the night, and with each passing mile, more disappeared. He forgot how to get home because he forgot where home was. He forgot his children's names, then that he had children at all. He forgot his own last name. By dawn, he couldn't remember his first name either. The logbook showed Kyle Anderson, but those words meant nothing. Just letters arranged in an order that should be significant but wasn't. He pulled into a truck stop somewhere, didn't know where. Got out of the truck, looked at the Kenworth, and didn't know if it was his. He walked into the diner and a waitress looked at him with concern. "Sir, are you all right?" Kyle tried to answer but couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. Couldn't remember anything before walking through that door. A trucker at the counter turned around. The man looked exhausted, haunted. "You were on the road, weren't you?" Kyle nodded slowly. "I think so." The trucker laughed bitterly. "None of us do. There are dozens of us, maybe hundreds." Kyle found a wallet in his pocket. ID card with a photo that might be him. Name, Kyle Anderson. Address in a city he'd never heard of. He walked back to the Kenworth, found paperwork that suggested it belonged to him. He climbed in and drove, heading west because the GPS said west, delivering cargo he couldn't remember accepting to a destination that meant nothing. Years have passed now, or maybe days. Kyle doesn't know. Time is a memory too, and the road took that along with everything else. He drives the same routes over and over, occasionally recognizing other drivers at truck stops. Men and women with the same empty look in their eyes. They exchange information they forget immediately. They warn other drivers about the road with backwards mile markers, but they can't remember why it's dangerous. But when he takes the exit, nothing looks right. He drives through neighborhoods that should trigger something, sees houses that might have been his, people who could be his family. But there's nothing. Just the road, the endless highway, and the knowledge that he's lost something important, but can't remember what. He still drives because it's all that's left. The road took everything else, and somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, the mile markers still count backwards, and other drivers still make the mistake of continuing forward, losing themselves 1 mile at a time, joining the convoy of the forgotten. Drivers who know only the highway because the highway is all they have left to remember. Story 2. The Toll Booth to Nowhere. Sandra Mills was running a late-night delivery from Atlanta to Nashville in July 2020, pushing hard to make her deadline. Around midnight, she approached a toll booth on I-24 that she'd never seen before. Sandra had driven this route 50 times at least. There was no toll booth on I-24 through Georgia. But there it was, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights blocking all lanes. Sandra slowed down, confused. Memories accepted? What kind of joke was this? She pulled up to the booth. The attendant was a woman in an old-fashioned uniform, the kind toll collectors wore decades ago before everything went electronic. "Toll, please," the woman said, her voice flat and mechanical. Sandra rolled down her window. "I don't have cash." The attendant shook her head. "Memory toll only. Choose a memory, any memory, Tiyasu." Sandra laughed nervously. "I don't understand." The attendant's face was expressionless. "No prank. You wish to pass. You must pay. Select a memory. Once paid, it will be removed. You will never recall it again." Sandra looked in her mirrors. The road behind her was gone, just darkness, as if it had ceased to exist. She couldn't turn back even if she wanted to. "This is insane," Sandra muttered. But the attendant just stared, waiting. Sandra thought of her worst memories, ones she wouldn't mind losing. The attendant typed on an ancient computer terminal. "Memory insufficient. Minor traumas are low value. Choose a happy memory." Sandra's stomach turned. The attendant nodded. Significant joy only. Birthdays, weddings, births, achievements, love. Sandra thought of her daughter's birth, the happiest day of her life. No, she couldn't give that up. Her wedding day, that was precious. But she needed to pass. She had to make this delivery. My high school graduation, Sandra said finally. The day I graduated. The attendant typed, and Sandra felt something shift inside her head, like a file being deleted. She tried to remember walking across the stage, receiving her diploma, her family cheering. Nothing. The memory was completely gone. The attendant handed her a receipt. Paid. The gate lifted. Sandra drove through, shaken. Behind her, the toll booth vanished as if it had never existed. She continued toward Nashville, but something felt wrong. Her GPS was rerouting, taking her off I-24 onto rural highways she didn't recognize. 10 minutes later, another toll booth appeared. Sandra's heart sank. She pulled up to the window. The attendant looked at her computer. No record of payment. Sandra's hands gripped the wheel. This is impossible. The attendant's expression never changed. Select a memory. Sandra realized with horror that she was trapped in a loop. Another toll booth, another memory demanded. She chose her first kiss, something important but not vital. The memory vanished instantly. She drove through. 5 minutes later, another toll booth, then another. Each time, the attendant demanded a happy memory. Sandra gave up her prom night, her first car, her college acceptance day, her best friend's wedding where she'd been maid of honor. Each memory disappeared completely, leaving blank spaces in her mind where joy had been. Sandra started crying as she drove, trying to remember the moments she'd lost. They were just gone, as if they'd never happened. Photos on her phone showed events she couldn't recall. She knew intellectually that these things had occurred, but the emotional content, the actual experience, was erased. The toll booths kept appearing. 6, 7, 8. Sandra was running out of happy memories. She gave up vacations, holidays, celebrations. Each payment left her emptier. By the 10th toll booth, she was sobbing, begging the attendant to let her pass without paying. I don't have anything left. The attendant was unmoved. Sandra thought of her daughter, Emma, now 15. She had so many memories of Emma growing up. First steps, first words, first day of school. These were her most precious memories, the ones she'd been protecting. No, Sandra said. I won't give those up. The attendant typed on her terminal. Refusal noted. Alternative payment available. Future memories. Sandra stared at the attendant. The attendant explained in her mechanical voice. You may pass by agreeing that future happy moments will be experienced but not retained. You will live joyful events but have no memory of them afterwards. Sandra knew it was a terrible bargain, but she couldn't stay trapped in this nightmare. The attendant tilted her head. All of them. Every joyful moment for the remainder of your life. You will experience happiness but never remember it. Sandra closed her eyes. She thought of Emma's upcoming 16th birthday, her graduation, her wedding someday. Sandra would be there, would feel joy in those moments, but would never remember them. She would become a person who could only remember the mundane and the painful. The attendant gestured to the booth around them. You remain here. This becomes your eternity. Sandra looked in her side mirror. Other trucks were lined up behind her now, dozens of them, all waiting at toll booths that stretched into the darkness. Other drivers who'd made the same terrible journey. I accept, Sandra whispered. The attendant processed the payment. Agreement sealed. All future joy memories will be collected upon formation. The gate lifted and Sandra drove through. The road ahead was suddenly clear, normal I-24 Nashville visible in the distance. Sandra made her delivery, drove home to Atlanta. Life continued. But true to the agreement, she began to notice the holes. Emma's 16th birthday came and went. Sandra knew it happened, saw photos, but couldn't remember the party. Emma's first date, her first boyfriend, her junior prom, all events Sandra attended, participated in, but afterwards couldn't recall. Sandra started keeping detailed journals, writing down happy moments immediately after they occurred, trying to capture them before they disappeared. But the written words were flat, emotionless. She could read about her daughter's achievements, her own successes, but they felt like someone else's life. Emma noticed her mother's strange behavior. "Mom, why don't you remember my recital? You were there." Sandra looked at the photos, saw herself in the audience, tears on her cheeks. But the memory was gone, collected by the toll booth the moment it formed. 5 years have passed. Sandra still drives, still makes deliveries. She's learned to fake the memories, to smile and nod when people reminisce about happy times she shared with them. Inside, she's hollow, a person who experiences joy but can never keep it. The toll booth took her past happiness and mortgaged her future. She exists in a permanent present where only pain and mundanity stay with her. Other drivers have reported similar toll booths appearing on different highways, always at night, always demanding memory payment. Sandra tried to warn them on CB channels, but her warnings sound insane and most drivers dismiss her as crazy. Those who don't dismiss her, who take the warnings seriously, tell stories of their own missing memories, their own encounters with toll booths that shouldn't exist. Sandra knows she'll never escape the payment plan. Every moment of joy she experiences from now until death will be collected, leaving her with a life that feels empty even as she lives through happiness. The toll booth got its payment. The road always gets its payment. And somewhere on I-24, that fluorescent-lit booth still appears to other drivers, still demands its toll, still takes the one thing that makes life worth living: the ability to remember that once, even briefly, you were truly happy. Story 3. The Mile That Lasted Forever. Trevor Walsh was hauling refrigerated seafood from Boston to Chicago in January 2019, fighting through a snowstorm that had reduced visibility to almost nothing. His GPS showed 1 mile remaining to the next rest stop, a place called Miller's Point. Trevor desperately needed to pull over, check his reefer unit, maybe wait out the worst of the storm. 6 miles, but the rest stop never appeared. 5 miles remaining. He checked his odometer. He'd traveled 3 miles since the countdown started. 5 miles ahead. Trevor continued driving. The odometer showed 5 miles, then 7, then 10, 5 miles to Miller's Point. The snowstorm intensified, and Trevor's truck was the only vehicle on the highway. No other traffic, no tire tracks, just pristine snow and his solitary rig cutting through the white darkness. At 15 miles, Trevor started to panic. He tried to call his dispatcher, but his phone had no signal despite showing full bars. He grabbed his CB radio. "Anyone out there?" Static answered, then a voice, distant and distorted. "Miller's Point doesn't exist." Trevor's hands tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" The voice crackled back. "GPS shows lots of places that don't exist. Miller's Point is a trap, the mile that never ends." Trevor looked in his mirrors. The road behind him was gone, swallowed by the storm. "I can't turn around." The voice went silent. Trevor drove on. 20 miles, 30, 40. The GPS never changed. The landscape outside never changed either. Same trees, same guardrails, same curve in the road, repeating endlessly. Trevor realized he was seeing the exact same section of highway over and over, like a looped video. He tried to stop, pulling over to the shoulder. But when he pressed the brake, his speedometer didn't change. 55 miles per hour, steady. His foot was on the brake, pressing hard, but the truck wouldn't slow down. Trevor's breath came in short gasps. He shifted to neutral, but the transmission wouldn't respond. He turned the key to shut off the engine, but it kept running. The truck was driving itself, maintaining speed, following the endless loop of highway. Trevor was just a passenger in his own vehicle. He watched the odometer climb, 50 miles, 70, 100. 5 miles to Miller's Point. His fuel gauge didn't move, stuck at 3/4 full despite the hours of driving. Trevor's clock showed 3:47 a.m. It had shown 3:47 a.m. when he first noticed the GPS error. Time had stopped, or looped, or broken somehow. Trevor screamed, pounded on the steering wheel, tried to break a window to escape. The glass wouldn't crack. His truck had become a prison. Hours passed, or seemed to. The clock never changed, but Trevor felt time moving, felt exhaustion creeping in. He tried to stay awake, terrified of what might happen if he fell asleep in this looping nightmare. But eventually, his body betrayed him. His eyes closed and he drifted off. Trevor woke to daylight. The storm was gone. He was parked at a rest stop, engine off, normal highway sounds around him. His GPS showed he'd arrived at Miller's Point. Trevor stumbled out of his cab, legs shaky. The rest stop was ordinary. Building, parking lot, vending machines, other trucks were parked nearby. He walked to the rest stop building in a daze. Inside, a trucker was pouring coffee. Trevor approached him. The trucker nodded. Trevor tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to him. The trucker just stared at him with concern. "You okay, buddy?" Trevor checked his phone. 43 missed calls from his dispatcher. His delivery was 12 hours overdue. He called back immediately. His dispatcher was furious. "Where the hell have you been?" Trevor looked at his logs. The timestamp showed he'd been driving for 18 hours straight, but he'd only experienced about 6 hours in that loop. Trevor completed his delivery to Chicago. The seafood somehow still fresh despite the delays. But something was wrong. When he drove back toward Boston, empty trailer, he saw the sign for Miller's Point rest stop. The GPS showed it was 1 mile ahead. Trevor's heart raced. He took the next exit, refusing to drive past that rest stop again, adding hours to his route. But a week later, on a different route through Pennsylvania, Trevor's GPS showed a rest stop 1 mile ahead. Miller's Point. Same name, impossible location. Trevor exited the highway immediately, hands shaking. He researched Miller's Point that night in a motel. According to maps, there were 3 rest stops with that name. One in Massachusetts, one in Ohio, one in Montana. But truckers on forums reported encountering Miller's Point in dozens of states, always 1 mile away, always unreachable. One post from a driver named Raymond described the exact same experience. The endless mile, the looping highway, time stopping at 3:47 a.m. Raymond claimed he'd been trapped for what felt like days before finally reaching the rest stop. After that, he saw Miller's Point on his GPS regularly, always 1 mile away, always a warning that he might slip back into the loop. Trevor started keeping detailed logs of his routes, noting every time Miller's Point appeared on his GPS. It happened once or twice a week, on different highways in different states. Each time, Trevor would exit immediately, avoiding the trap. But the exits were getting scarce. Sometimes Miller's Point would appear on stretches of highway with no exits for 50 miles. 3 months after his first encounter, Trevor was forced to drive past Miller's Point on a remote stretch of highway in Nevada. No exits available, no way to avoid it. 7. Trevor prayed he would reach the rest stop normally this time. 5 miles, his truck's controls locked up again. Same sensation, speedometer frozen, brakes unresponsive. The loop began again. Trevor drove through darkness, the same section of Nevada highway repeating endlessly. But this time, he wasn't alone. Other trucks appeared, all driving the same loop, all trapped. Trevor counted 7 rigs, all traveling at the same speed, same spacing, like a convoy stuck in time. Trevor grabbed his CB. Trevor asked how long they'd been trapped. The answers varied. Some said hours, some said days. One driver claimed he'd been in the loop for 3 weeks. Trevor realized the loop didn't release everyone at the same time. Some escaped quickly, some remained trapped indefinitely. He needed to find a way out. He studied the repeating landscape, looking for any variation, any difference in the loops. On his 63rd pass, he noticed something. A barely visible dirt road branching off the highway, there for just a moment before the loop reset. On his next pass, Trevor jerked his wheel hard toward that dirt road. The truck resisted, trying to stay on the main highway, but Trevor fought it with all his strength. The wheel turned inches, then a foot, then fully. The truck lurched off the highway onto the dirt road, and suddenly Trevor was free of the loop. He was on a narrow trail through the desert, barely wide enough for his rig. The GPS went haywire, displaying error messages and corrupted maps. Trevor drove for 20 minutes before the trail reconnected with a highway. Not I-90, but a different road entirely, Highway 50 in Nevada, 200 miles from where he'd entered the loop. Trevor never returned to that stretch of highway. He plotted routes that avoided every location where Miller's Point had appeared on his GPS. But other drivers aren't so lucky. Forum posts continue appearing from truckers trapped in the endless mile, driving loops that last hours or days, some claiming they've been stuck for years in a mile that never ends, watching their clocks frozen at 3:47 a.m., burning fuel that never depletes, delivering cargo that never arrives, forever approaching a rest stop that exists and doesn't exist 1 mile away for all eternity. Story 4. The Highway of Alternate Drivers. Brian Foster was driving his usual route from Memphis to Little Rock in August 2021 when he saw himself at a rest stop. Not someone who looked like him. Himself exactly. Same clothes, same truck, same Tennessee Titans cap. The other Brian was fueling up at the diesel pump directly across from him. Brian's mind went blank. He stared at his doppelganger, who was going through the motions of fueling, checking tire pressure, wiping down his windshield. Normal trucker routine. The other Brian glanced up, made eye contact with him, and froze. Both of them stared at each other, perfectly identical, both clearly thinking the same thought. This is impossible. Brian's doppelganger walked over slowly. They stood face to face, saying nothing. Finally, Brian found his voice. The other Brian looked just as confused. "I'm Brian Foster. I drive this route 3 times a week." They compared licenses, both showing the same name, same address, same DOT medical card numbers, identical. Brian asked. The doppelganger pointed west. "Memphis, I'm heading to Little Rock." Brian felt his skin crawl. "Same." They stood in silence, 2 identical men trying to process the impossible. The doppelganger spoke carefully. "Maybe we should both just continue on." Brian nodded slowly. They returned to their respective trucks and drove away in opposite directions. Brian headed east on I-40, hands shaking on the wheel. He tried to rationalize. Maybe he had a twin he never knew about, some bizarre coincidence. But the clothes were identical down to the coffee stain on his shirt from that morning. The trucks were the same model year, same license plate. Brian's phone rang. His wife, Karen. Brian's voice was unsteady. "Karen, this is going to sound crazy, but I just saw myself an exact copy of..." Karen laughed. "You're tired, babe." Brian insisted it was real, but Karen just told him to be safe and hung up. 20 minutes later, Brian approached another rest stop. He almost drove past, but his fuel was low. He pulled in, and his heart stopped. His truck was already there. Same truck, same license plate, parked in the lot. Brian parked nearby and approached cautiously. The cab was empty, but the engine was warm. Brian walked into the rest stop building. There at the coffee station was another Brian Foster. This one looked more tired, wore different clothes, but had the same face, same build, same mannerisms. The alternate Brian saw him and dropped his coffee cup. Brian's voice cracked. The alternate explained, "I've been seeing versions of myself for 2 weeks. Different clothes, different moods, but all me. All driving the same routes. There are dozens of us, maybe more." A third Brian entered the rest stop from the bathroom. Then a fourth walked in from outside. All of them Brian Foster, all of them truckers, all wearing variations of the same expression. Confusion, fear, exhaustion. They gathered together, 5 identical men trying to understand what was happening. One of the Brians, wearing a different cap, said he'd been researching. "I think we're seeing parallel versions of ourselves. Different timelines, different choices, but all driving trucks, all on I-40 today." Another Brian disagreed. A third suggested they were all hallucinating. Brian, the original as far as he knew, tried calling Karen again. She didn't answer. He called his dispatcher. The dispatcher sounded confused. "Brian, you called 10 minutes ago." Brian felt sick. One of the other Brians had called impersonating him or being him from another reality. The Brians decided to stay together, try to figure out what was happening. They drove in a convoy, 5 identical trucks following I-40 east. But at each rest stop, they encountered more. By nightfall, there were 17 Brian Fosters, all driving the same route, all equally confused and terrified. One of the Brians suggested they differentiate themselves. They started using numbers, Brian 1 through Brian 17. They compared their lives, looking for divergence points. Most were identical up to today, same childhood, same wife, same job. But small differences emerged. Brian 7 had a daughter, while the others only had sons. Brian 11 had never been to Florida, while the others had. Brian 14 drove a Peterbilt. Everyone else drove Kenworths. They realized the differences were branching points, moments where their timelines had diverged slightly. And somehow today, on this highway, all those timelines were colliding. The question was, why? And would they diverge again, or were they trapped in this merged reality? At a truck stop near Little Rock, they encountered something worse. A Brian Foster, who claimed he'd been driving for months, constantly meeting versions of himself. "It doesn't stop," he said, his eyes hollow. "You'll keep seeing yourself over and over. Eventually, you can't remember which Brian you were originally. The identity dissolves." The original Brian, Brian 1, refused to accept this. The hollow-eyed Brian laughed. "Maybe, but you'd have to choose which timeline to stay in, and that means all the other Brians cease to exist." That night, the Brians made camp in a rest area, their trucks parked in a circle. They talked through the night, sharing stories of their lives, finding comfort in meeting themselves, men who understood them perfectly because they were them. But underneath, the horror grew. If they were merging, what happened to their individual existence? Were they becoming one Brian spread across 18 bodies? At dawn, Brian 1 made a decision. "I'm going home, back to Memphis." The others nodded. Some decided to join him, others to continue forward. The convoy split. Brian 1 headed west with 6 other versions of himself. But as they drove, more Brians appeared on the highway. Brian 1 counted 43 identical trucks by the time he reached Memphis. The highway was filling with him. Every lane occupied by Brian Foster, all driving Kenworths, all heading in different directions but trapped in the same space. Brian 1's phone rang. Karen's number. He answered. Karen's voice was terrified. "There are men at the house. They all look like you. They all have keys. They all claim they live here." Brian 1 realized the merging wasn't limited to the highway. It was spreading to every location he existed in, every place Brian Foster had been. His home, his workplace, his family. All the timelines were collapsing into one space, and the world couldn't hold multiple versions of the same person in the same reality. Brian 1 pulled over, shaking. Around him, other versions of himself were also pulling over, all reaching the same realization at the same time. They were erasing reality by existing in it simultaneously. One of them had to leave, had to stop existing to let the others remain. But who? Which Brian Foster was the original? They were all equally real, all equally valid. Brian 1 looked at his hands, wondering if he was even solid anymore, or if he was just one probability among many, all collapsing into a singularity that would destroy everything. The highway stretched ahead, filled with his own truck, repeated infinitely. Brian Foster, whoever he was, whichever version was real, sat in his cab and wept, knowing that he couldn't go home, couldn't see his wife or children because home was filled with him already. He was trapped on the highway, one of infinite drivers, all the same, all doomed to drive forever because stopping meant confronting the impossible question, which one of us deserves to exist? Heather Montgomery accepted an emergency delivery contract in March 2022. High-priority cargo from a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey to a facility in Arizona. The pay was exceptional, and the requirements were strict. Maintain temperature at precisely 34 degrees. No X-ray inspections at weigh stations. Direct route only. The cargo container was small, just a 6-foot cube, heavily insulated and locked with biometric seals. Heather signed the confidentiality agreement without reading the details, loaded the container, and headed west. The temperature monitor on her dashboard showed a steady 34 degrees. Everything was normal for the first 500 miles. Then, somewhere in Pennsylvania, Heather noticed the dashboard display glitching. The temperature readout flickered, showing impossible numbers. 34, 187, 94, 34. She pulled over immediately, checked the reefer unit. It was functioning normally, the temperature inside actually stable, but the display continued showing random fluctuations. Heather's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Montgomery, do not be alarmed. Your cargo is functioning as designed. The temperature anomalies are expected." Heather's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" The voice was calm, clinical. "You are carrying a prototype. The temperature fluctuations are not malfunctions. They are dimensional variations. Your cargo exists in multiple temperature states simultaneously." Heather hung up, heart pounding. Dimensional variations, multiple states? She wasn't carrying pharmaceuticals. This was something else entirely. She considered abandoning the load, but the contract penalties were severe. She continued west, watching the temperature display cycle through impossible readings. In Ohio, Heather stopped at a rest area. She walked around her trailer, examining the cargo container. It looked normal, standard insulated unit, but standing next to it, Heather felt strange. The air around the container seemed to shimmer, like heat waves, but the ambient temperature was cold. She reached out to touch the container, and her hand passed through it for a moment before making contact with solid metal. Heather jerked her hand back, staring at the container. It had been intangible for just a second, like it wasn't entirely present in reality. She climbed back in her cab and drove, her mind racing. What kind of prototype existed in multiple states? What was she delivering? As night fell, Heather noticed something else. The landscape outside her windows was changing in ways that made no sense. She'd drive past a barn, then 5 minutes later, see the same barn on the opposite side of the highway. Towns appeared in her mirrors that she hadn't driven through. Her GPS showed her route correctly, but the actual terrain didn't match. The unknown number called again. "Ms. Montgomery, you are experiencing localized reality distortions. The cargo's presence is affecting the space around it. Please remain calm and continue driving. The effect radius is limited to approximately 100 meters from the container. Heather shouted into the phone, "Safe? The world is glitching around me." The voice replied, "The prototype is a quantum stabilizer. It exists in multiple realities simultaneously, which causes minor distortions in local space-time. You were chosen for this delivery because of your excellent safety record and psychological stability profile." Heather wanted to refuse to dump the cargo on the side of the road, but something in the voice's tone made her continue. "What happens if I stop?" The voice was quiet for a moment. "The prototype is currently balanced between realities. If the delivery is interrupted, it may destabilize completely. The effect radius would expand exponentially. We estimate that an uncontrolled destabilization would affect a sphere approximately 3 miles in diameter, causing permanent reality fractures. Everything within that radius would exist in multiple states simultaneously. In essence, Miss..." Heather's blood ran cold. She was carrying a bomb that didn't explode but shattered reality itself. And she was the trigger. If she stopped, if she deviated from the route, she would fragment into multiple versions of herself across different realities. She drove on, hands shaking, watching the world glitch and shimmer around her. In Indiana, Heather passed a gas station that changed appearance as she watched. One moment it was a modern Shell station, the next an old 1970s Texaco, then a structure that looked futuristic, all metal and glowing lights. She blinked and it settled back into the Shell station. The cargo was pulling different versions of reality into her perception. Heather's CB radio picked up transmissions that made no sense. Voices discussing technologies that didn't exist, reporting traffic on highways that weren't built yet, talking about current events from years in the past or future. She heard herself on the CB, but not her own voice. Different versions of Heather Montgomery from alternate realities, all delivering the same cargo, all experiencing the same distortions. In Illinois, Heather saw another truck driving parallel to her on the highway. It was her truck, identical with herself behind the wheel. Then the truck phased out of existence, gone as if it had never been there. The unknown number called repeatedly, providing updates. "You are doing well, Ms. Montgomery. You have crossed the halfway point. The cargo's stability is improving as you approach the destination." Heather barely listened. She was focused on the road, on driving straight, on not stopping. In Missouri, reality distortions intensified. Heather drove through a stretch of highway that was simultaneously day and night, the sky half bright, half dark. She passed cars from different eras, Model Ts, modern sedans, vehicles that looked like they belonged in science fiction. All of them coexisted on the same highway, all equally real. Heather's own perception began to fracture. She could see multiple timelines simultaneously. The highway as it was now, as it had been under construction decades ago, as it would be in ruins centuries from now. All layered over each other, all visible at once. She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing only on the feel of the wheel, the sound of the engine. In New Mexico, just 100 miles from the destination, Heather encountered something that nearly broke her. She saw herself on the side of the road, standing next to a crashed truck. Her truck. The alternate Heather was staring at the wreckage, crying. As Heather drove past, the alternate version looked up and screamed, "It exploded!" The cargo exploded. "Everyone in Santa Rosa is gone." Heather floored the accelerator, refusing to look back. That was an alternate timeline, a version where she'd failed. She wasn't going to fail. She was going to deliver this reality-bending nightmare and never accept another specialized contract again. The facility in Arizona appeared at dawn, a massive complex surrounded by containment fields that she could actually see, shimmering barriers that bent light around them. Heather backed her trailer into the receiving bay and technicians in protective suits immediately surrounded the container. They disconnected it from her trailer using robotic arms, never touching it directly. A woman in a lab coat approached Heather's cab. "Ms. Montgomery, you've completed an extraordinary service. The prototype's safe arrival is critical to our research." Heather barely heard her. She was staring at the container as it was lowered into an underground chamber, watching reality stabilize around it as it moved into proper containment. Heather drove away from the facility, empty trailer rattling behind her. But the effects of the cargo hadn't completely faded. For weeks afterwards, she saw glimpses of alternate realities, roads that didn't exist, versions of herself making different choices, timelines bleeding through. Her therapist said it was PTSD. Heather knew better. She'd spent 3 days driving with a hole in reality, and some of that hole had gotten into her. She never accepted another specialized contract. She drives standard freight now, normal cargo, nothing unusual. But sometimes, late at night on empty highways, Heather sees her alternate selves driving past, delivering their own impossible cargo, trapped in their own reality distortions, and she knows that somewhere in some laboratory they're preparing another prototype, another quantum stabilizer, and some other driver will get the call, will accept the contract, will spend 3 days driving through fractured reality, carrying the cargo that changes everything just by existing. Nathan Pierce bought a used CB radio at a truck stop in Alabama in October 2020, replacing his old one that had finally died. The radio was vintage, 1980s model, but the seller said it had been refurbished and worked perfectly. Nathan installed it in his Freightliner and continued his route north. The radio functioned normally for the first day. Standard trucker chatter, weather reports, warnings about speed traps. Nathan was making good time from Mobile to Detroit. Then around midnight in Tennessee, the radio crackled with an unusual transmission. "Driver in the white Freightliner, northbound on I-65, mile marker 114. In 7 minutes, you will encounter an accident, jackknifed semi in the left lane. If you maintain current speed and lane, you will collide." Nathan frowned. No accident was visible ahead. His CB handle hadn't been mentioned, just a description of his truck. But there were lots of white Freightliners on I-65. Still, the specific nature of the warning made him cautious. He moved to the right lane. 7 minutes later, exactly as predicted, Nathan rounded a curve and saw it. A jackknifed semi completely blocking the left lane. Emergency vehicles just arriving. If Nathan had stayed in the left lane, he would have hit it at 65 miles per hour. His hands tightened on the wheel as he carefully passed the accident scene. Nathan grabbed his CB mic. Thanks to whoever warned me about that accident." Static answered, then a voice. "Warning is our function. We observe the roads." Nathan asked who we were, but the voice didn't respond. 50 miles later, the radio crackled again. "Driver in the white Freightliner. In 12 minutes, tire blowout on your trailer, left rear. If you do not reduce speed and prepare, you will lose control." Nathan checked his mirrors. His tires looked fine in the darkness, but the first warning had been accurate. He slowed to 45. 12 minutes later, exactly as predicted, Nathan felt the telltale shudder of a tire blowing out. Left rear, just as the voice had said. Because he'd slowed down and prepared, he maintained control easily, pulling over safely to change the tire. Nathan stared at his CB radio, unnerved. How had the voice known about a tire that hadn't blown yet? He keyed his mic. "Okay, who are you?" The voice responded immediately. "We are observers. We exist outside linear time. We see all moments on the highway simultaneously. We warn drivers when we can, save lives when possible. You are fortunate. Your radio can receive our transmission." Nathan's skin crawled. Outside linear time? What did that mean? He asked, but the voice went silent. Nathan changed his tire and continued north, the CB radio sitting ominously on his dashboard. For the next 100 miles, it remained quiet, just normal trucker chatter. Nathan began to think the strange voice was gone. Then in Kentucky, the voice returned. "Driver in the white Freightliner, stop immediately. Do not proceed. In 4 miles, you will die. We can see it. The event is fixed." Nathan's heart raced. He pulled over immediately, hands shaking. "What happens?" The voice was urgent. "Bridge collapse, 4 miles ahead. Your truck will be on the bridge when it fails. 6 vehicles will fall. All occupants will die. The collapse happens in 18 minutes. Nathan sat frozen in his cab. A bridge collapse. He called 911, tried to report it, but how could he explain? He had no proof, just a voice on a CB radio. Nathan waited, watching his clock. 18 minutes passed. His CB radio erupted with chatter, panicked voices, screaming, calls for help. Then news started coming through. Bridge collapse on I-65. Multiple vehicles involved. Casualties confirmed. Nathan pulled up news on his phone. 6 vehicles had fallen, exactly as the voice had said. If he'd continued driving, he would have been the 7th. Nathan sat in his truck, crying with relief and horror. The voice had saved him, but couldn't save the others. He keyed his mic with a shaking hand. The voice responded, quieter now. "We can only warn those who can hear us. Your radio is special. It exists partially outside normal space. The previous owner knew this. That is why he sold it." Nathan didn't understand. The voice explained, "We see all deaths on the highway. We warn when we can, but we cannot save everyone. Most radios cannot receive our transmission, and even when we warn, some events are fixed points. Some deaths cannot be prevented. You will receive warnings about accidents you cannot stop. You will know others are about to die, and you will be unable to help." Nathan realized the curse he'd acquired with the radio. He would know about accidents before they happened, but wouldn't always be able to prevent them. He would hear warnings about other drivers, strangers, and watch helplessly as they drove toward death. "I'll warn them," Nathan said. The voice was silent for a moment. "You may try. Most will not believe you, and the warnings will multiply. You will hear constantly about accidents, deaths, tragedies. Your radio will never be quiet. Every moment on the highway, someone is dying. You will hear every death we can observe." The previous owner lasted 3 weeks before the voices drove him mad. Nathan considered throwing the radio away, but he'd already been saved 3 times. How many more warnings might save his life? He kept the radio and continued his route to Detroit, delivering his load. But the voice was right. The warnings multiplied. Every hour, sometimes every few minutes, the voice would warn about accidents on highways across the country. Deaths Nathan couldn't prevent, tragedies he could only observe. Semi-rollover on I-10 in Texas, multi-car pileup on I-90 in South Dakota, pedestrian strike on Highway 40 in California. The litany of death was constant. Nathan tried to warn other drivers when the accidents were near him, but most dismissed him as crazy. A few listened and were saved. Most didn't. Nathan started having nightmares. He would dream of all the accidents he'd been warned about, seeing them in vivid detail despite never witnessing them. The voice showed him the deaths, made him understand what he couldn't prevent. Drivers burning in crashed vehicles, families killed in collisions, bodies on pavement. After 2 weeks, Nathan couldn't sleep. The voice continued even when he parked, even when he turned the radio off. It was inside his head now, constant warnings about deaths across the highway system. Nathan tried to sell the radio, but nobody would buy it. He tried to destroy it, smashing it with a hammer. The radio broke into pieces, but the voice remained, transmitting directly into his mind. Nathan checked himself into a hospital, begging for help. The doctors said he was experiencing auditory hallucinations from stress and sleep deprivation. They prescribed medication, but it didn't stop the voice. Nathan tracked the warnings, called them into highway patrol when he could. Some were prevented, most weren't. He became obsessed with the death toll, keeping a journal of every warning, every accident he couldn't stop. In 3 months, the voice had warned him about 847 fatal accidents. Nathan had managed to prevent 7 of them by warning the right people at the right time. 7 lives saved out of 847 dead. The math haunted him. He was failing. The previous owner had been right, the knowledge was unbearable. Nathan stopped driving, unable to focus on the road while the voice constantly reported deaths. He stayed home, but the warnings continued. The voice didn't care if he was driving. It warned him anyway, a constant reminder of the carnage happening on highways across America every moment of every day. Nathan found the previous owner through the truck stop's records. The man's name was Michael Torres. Nathan called him, desperate for answers. "How did you make it stop?" Michael's response was tired. "I didn't escape. I just passed it to you. The radio finds new listeners. I'm free now, but you're trapped. Eventually, you'll sell that radio or give it away, and someone else will become the listener. That's how it works." Nathan hung up, staring at the broken pieces of the CB radio in his trash can. Even destroyed, it transmitted. The voice was permanent now, a part of him. He would hear highway deaths for the rest of his life, unable to save most of them. Forced to know about tragedies he was powerless to prevent. Nathan doesn't leave his apartment anymore. He sits with his journal, recording every warning, tracking every accident. His walls are covered with maps marked with deaths, a permanent memorial to all the people the voice warned him about, but he couldn't save. The voice continues day and night, an endless report of highway fatalities, and Nathan listens because he has no choice, the CB radio that predicted deaths having claimed its final victim. Not his life, but his sanity, trapped forever in a hell of knowing when and where people die but being unable to stop it. Story 7. The rest stop that aged everything. Olivia Grant pulled into a rest stop on Highway 87 in Texas at 4:30 p.m. on May 12, 2019. She needed to use the restroom and grab coffee before the final stretch to her Lubbock delivery. The rest stop looked normal. Small building, parking lot, picnic tables. A few cars were parked there, nothing unusual. Olivia parked her Volvo, climbed down, and walked toward the building. The air felt strange, heavier somehow, like walking through humidity even though the Texas day was dry. She dismissed the sensation and went inside. The restroom was clean, the coffee was fresh. She was in and out in 10 minutes. When Olivia returned to her truck, she stopped cold. The Volvo looked different. The paint was faded, rust visible on the wheel wells, the tires worn. She had driven a nearly new truck into this rest stop. What she was looking at was a truck that had aged years in 10 minutes. Olivia approached slowly, touching the hood. The metal was warm, but not from the sun. It felt like the warmth of old metal that had been sitting for years. Her hand came away dirty, covered in a patina of age. She opened the driver's door. The interior was deteriorated, seats cracked and faded, dashboard sun-damaged, the new car smell replaced with musty oldness. Olivia checked her phone. 4:47 p.m. Only 17 minutes had passed. She looked around the rest stop. The other cars in the parking lot were ancient, some of them models from the 1990s that looked like they'd been sitting for decades. One car had plants growing through the hood, as if it had been abandoned for years. A man emerged from the rest stop building. He looked elderly, moving slowly. As he got closer to his car, Olivia watched him age in real time. His hair went from gray to white, his posture stooped further. His movements became more labored. By the time he reached his vehicle, he looked 20 years older than when he'd exited the building. The man noticed Olivia staring. His voice was thin, elderly. Olivia nodded, unable to speak. The man sighed. This place ages everything. The longer you stay, the more you age. I was 45 when I pulled in. That was an hour ago. He looked at his liver-spotted hands. Olivia felt panic rising. We need to leave. The man shook his head. My car won't start. The battery aged out. The fuel degraded. I'm trapped here. He gestured to the other vehicles. Same as them. Look closer. Some of those cars have bodies in them. Olivia ran to her Volvo, turned the key. The engine coughed, but didn't start. She tried again. Nothing. The truck had aged beyond functionality in the 17 minutes she'd been at the rest stop. She checked her mirrors, saw herself reflected, new lines on her face, gray strands in her hair that hadn't been there this morning. She'd aged too. Olivia grabbed her phone to call for help, but the device was dead, the battery swollen with age, the screen cracked. Her CB radio in the truck was corroded, useless. She was trapped with no communication, no functioning vehicle, aging in real time. The elderly man approached, even older now than moments before. There's a pattern. The aging accelerates the longer you stay. First hour you age about 20 years, second hour 40 years. He didn't finish the sentence. I don't think I'll make it to the third hour. Olivia looked around desperately. The rest stop building itself was old but not ancient, as if it was somehow immune or aged more slowly. She had an idea. What if we stay inside the building? The man considered this. Maybe, but I don't think I can make it back there. Too old. Olivia helped him, supporting his weight as they shuffled toward the building. With each step, she felt herself aging. Her joints ached, her breathing became labored, her vision blurred slightly. By the time they reached the door, Olivia knew she was at least 40 years older than when she'd first pulled in. Inside the building, the aging slowed but didn't stop. Olivia could feel it happening, a gradual deterioration. Her hands developed age spots as she watched. Her back developed a stoop. The man collapsed on a bench, breathing heavily. Not enough. Still aging. Olivia explored the building, looking for answers. A back room held supplies, old food, degraded tools, a logbook. She opened the logbook and found entries from other travelers, dates going back decades. The entries described the same phenomenon, a rest stop that aged everything, trapping people until they died of old age. One entry from 1987 offered a theory. The rest stop exists in accelerated time. Maybe a time dilation effect, maybe something else. The only escape is to reach the highway before aging too much. Vehicle functionality is critical. Olivia read through more entries, looking for anyone who'd escaped. Most entries just stopped mid-sentence, as if the writer had become too old to continue. But one entry from 2003 offered hope. Managed to roll my truck out of the parking lot using gravity. The slope is slight, but enough. Once I reached the highway, the aging stopped. Aged 30 years in that place, but alive. Warning to others, don't turn off your engine. Olivia looked at the man on the bench. He'd aged into his 80s now, barely conscious. She couldn't save him, but maybe she could save herself. She ran back outside, each step aging her further. By the time she reached her Volvo, she was visibly elderly, 60 years old at least. Olivia assessed the parking lot. There was a slight downward slope toward the highway exit. If she could get her truck into neutral, release the brakes, she might roll out. She climbed into the cab, every movement painful with arthritis that had developed in minutes. The truck's systems were dead, but mechanical components might still work. Olivia shifted into neutral, released the parking brake. The truck didn't move. She climbed down, positioned herself at the front, and pushed with all her strength. Her elderly body protested, muscles straining. The truck rocked slightly, but didn't roll. Olivia pushed again, screaming with effort. The truck moved an inch, then another. Slowly, agonizingly, she got it rolling. Once momentum built, the truck rolled faster. Olivia chased it, her aged body barely able to keep up. She grabbed the door handle, pulled herself into the cab as the truck rolled toward the highway exit. The truck picked up speed on the slope. Olivia didn't have brakes, couldn't stop, just held on as the truck rolled out of the rest stop parking lot, across a small access road and onto the shoulder of Highway 87. As soon as the wheels touched the highway, Olivia felt the change. The aging stopped. Her body was still elderly, still damaged by the rest stop's effect, but she wasn't getting older. Olivia sat in her truck on the shoulder, crying. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. A 70-year-old woman stared back. Though Olivia was 32, she'd aged 40 years in less than an hour. Her phone, when she checked it, was still dead. But a passing truck stopped, the driver climbing down to help. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The driver stared at her deteriorated truck, the elderly woman in the cab. Olivia tried to explain, but the words came out confused. The driver called for help and paramedics arrived, transporting Olivia to a hospital in Lubbock. Doctors were baffled. Olivia had the body of a 70-year-old but insisted she was 32. Tests showed accelerated aging. Telomeres shortened, cellular damage consistent with decades of life. Medical science had no explanation. Olivia tried telling them about the rest stop, but nobody believed her. 5 years have passed. Olivia looks 90 now, her body continuing to age normally but from the accelerated baseline. She's had to retire from trucking, her body too frail. She's tried reporting the rest stop, warning other drivers, but the location doesn't appear on maps. Highway 87 shows no rest stop at the mile marker she remembers. Olivia has dedicated her remaining years to research, tracking reports of drivers who've aged rapidly, vehicles found abandoned and deteriorated. She's found 17 cases that match the pattern, 17 other people who pulled into a rest stop and aged decades in minutes. Most didn't escape. Their bodies were found in their vehicles, aged to death, dismissed as cases of misidentification or clerical errors. Olivia knows the rest stop is still out there, somewhere on Highway 87, or maybe on different highways at different times, a pocket of accelerated time waiting for travelers who make the mistake of stopping. And she knows that her warning, like the warnings in the logbook, will eventually be found by someone else who's already trapped, aging in a parking lot where time moves like a river in flood, carrying away years in minutes, leaving nothing but elderly bodies and deteriorated vehicles as evidence of the rest stop that steals time itself. Story 8. The truck stop with no exit. Antonio Reyes pulled into a truck stop called Midpoint Travel Plaza on I-80 in Nebraska at 11:00 p.m. on September 15, 2020. He needed fuel, food, and a shower before continuing to his Denver delivery. The truck stop was large, well-lit, and busy with other truckers. Everything seemed normal. Antonio fueled up, parked in the lot, and headed inside. The facility was impressive. Full restaurant, convenience store, showers, even a small arcade. He ate dinner, took a shower, grabbed some supplies. Other truckers were doing the same, all of them moving through their routines. Antonio headed back to his truck around 1:00 a.m. That's when he noticed something odd. The parking lot seemed bigger than when he'd arrived. He walked toward where he'd parked, but the rows of trucks seemed to extend forever. Antonio checked his parking location on his phone. Row H, space 24. He found row H, but it had at least 50 spaces all occupied. He walked the entire row twice, his truck wasn't there. Antonio went back inside, approached the customer service desk. "I can't find my truck." The attendant, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, checked her computer. "Sir, we don't have a row H." Antonio stared at her. "I have a photo of the sign, row H, space 24. The attendant looked at his phone photo and her expression changed. She led Antonio to a back office where a manager sat at a desk covered in files. The manager said when he saw Antonio, The attendant nodded. The manager gestured for Antonio to sit. "Mr. Reyes, you're not the first person to have this problem. The truck stop has expansions, sections that appear and disappear. Your truck is here somewhere, but finding it can be difficult." Antonio shook his head. "That's impossible." The manager opened a file. "We have 37 reports from the past 5 years. Truckers who parked, went inside, and came back to find their vehicles in different locations or in rows that shouldn't exist." Antonio felt cold. The manager continued. "The truck stop is larger than it appears, much larger. Some sections are only accessible at certain times. Your truck is somewhere in row H, but row H isn't always connected to the main lot. You'll need to keep searching." Antonio stood up, angry now. "I don't have days, I have a delivery deadline." The manager's expression was sympathetic but resigned. "I can't. The lot changes. The best I can do is give you advice. Keep moving. Check different sections regularly and don't try to leave through the exits." Antonio walked out, furious and confused. He returned to the parking lot and started a systematic search. Row A through F, checking every truck. His Peterbilt wasn't there. He walked to where he thought row H should be, but found only row F and then a fence. Antonio walked along the fence and after 100 yards found a gap. Through it was row G, which the attendant had said didn't exist. Row G was darker, fewer lights, and the trucks parked there looked older. Antonio walked down the row, checking each vehicle. At the end of row G, another gap in the fence revealed row H. Antonio's relief flooded through him. There was row H, and there in space 24 was his blue Peterbilt. Antonio ran toward his truck, but as he got closer, the space between him and the vehicle seemed to stretch. He walked faster, then ran, but the truck stayed the same distance away, as if the parking lot was expanding as he moved. Antonio stopped, breathing hard. This wasn't right. This was impossible. He walked backward, watching the truck. It got further away, confirming his suspicion. The lot was changing size based on his movement. Antonio tried walking sideways, angling toward the truck. The distance narrowed slightly. He continued this angular approach, and after 20 minutes of zigzagging, he finally reached his Peterbilt. Antonio climbed in, started the engine, and immediately tried to drive out. He followed what he thought was the exit route, but the lanes curved in ways that made no sense. He'd drive toward an exit, only to find himself back at the row where he'd started. After 30 minutes of trying, Antonio gave up and parked again. He went back inside the truck stop, found other truckers, and asked if anyone else was having trouble leaving. A woman named Teresa nodded immediately. "I've been here for 3 days. I can find my truck, but I can't get to the highway." Antonio looked around the restaurant. How many of these truckers were trapped? Teresa continued. "There are maybe 15 of us who can't leave. The rest are new arrivals who don't know they're trapped yet." She gestured to a group of truckers playing cards. "They've been here for weeks." Antonio approached the card players. One of them, an older man named Carl, explained, "The truck stop exists in folded space. The parking lot is bigger on the inside than the outside, and the exits lead to nowhere. Some people eventually get out. The truck stop lets you leave when it wants to." Antonio asked how they survived. Carl shrugged. "Credit cards work, food is available, showers work." Antonio refused to accept this. He went back to his truck and drove systematically, mapping every lane, every turn. The parking lot was a maze with impossible geometry. Lanes that should run parallel would intersect. Rows that should be adjacent were separated by miles. Antonio drove for hours, burning through fuel, and eventually ended up back at his original parking spot. Days passed. Antonio fell into a routine. Eat, sleep in his truck, attempt to escape, fail, repeat. His delivery deadline passed. His dispatcher called repeatedly, messages increasingly angry. Antonio tried to explain, but his words sounded insane. Eventually, he stopped answering. On the fourth day, Antonio found something new. A section of the parking lot that looked abandoned. Trucks there were covered in dust, some with flat tires, some with plants growing around them. One truck had a skeleton in the driver's seat. Antonio backed away slowly. This was a graveyard for truckers who'd never escaped. Teresa found him that evening. "You saw the old section. Some people die here waiting to leave." Antonio felt despair settling over him. "There has to be a way out." Teresa shook her head. "If there is, nobody's found it. People leave randomly." Weeks turned into months. Antonio's truck became his home. He worked odd jobs inside the truck stop for meal vouchers. He joined the card games with Carl and the other long-term residents. They'd all given up on deadlines, on obligations, on the outside world. The truck stop was their reality now. One morning, Antonio woke up and decided to try again. He drove through the maze of parking lanes, expecting the usual loops and dead ends. But this time, something was different. The exit lane actually led to an exit. Antonio saw I-80 ahead, real highway, other vehicles. He accelerated, terrified the exit would vanish. Antonio burst out of the truck stop onto I-80, and the facility disappeared in his mirrors. Just gone, as if it had never existed. Antonio pulled over, shaking. He checked his phone. He'd been at the truck stop for 4 months. 4 months lost. His delivery was long abandoned. His company had fired him. His truck had been reported missing. Antonio tried to find the truck stop again, drove back and forth on I-80. No midpoint travel plaza existed. Other truckers, he asked, had never heard of it. But online, Antonio found forums with reports from other drivers. Stories of the expanding truck stop, the maze parking lot, the trap that held truckers for days or months before randomly releasing them. Antonio never drove I-80 in Nebraska again. He changed routes, changed companies, changed his whole approach to trucking. But sometimes on other highways in other states, he sees a truck stop that looks familiar. Large, well-lit, busy, and he drives past without stopping, knowing that some truck stops are entry points with no guaranteed exit. Places that exist in folded space where parking lots expand forever and drivers become permanent residents of a facility that decides when, if ever, they're allowed to leave. Story 9. The Shadow Following the Headlights. Carmen Diaz was driving through Montana on Highway 2 at 3:00 a.m. in November 2021 when she first noticed the shadow. It appeared in her headlights, a dark shape moving on the road ahead, staying just at the edge of the light. At first, Carmen thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or wolf. But as she drove, the shadow stayed exactly the same distance ahead, matching her speed. Carmen slowed down. The shadow slowed down. She sped up. The shadow accelerated, maintaining its position at the edge of her headlight reach. Carmen's hands tightened on the wheel. This wasn't an animal. Animals didn't move like that, didn't maintain such precise distance. The shadow was roughly human-shaped, but wrong. The proportions didn't match. The arms were too long, the head too large. The legs bent at angles that human joints couldn't achieve. And it moved without walking, gliding across the pavement in a way that made Carmen's stomach turn. Carmen tried to tell herself it was a trick of the lights, shadows created by her headlights hitting road debris or fog. But the night was clear and the shadow was too defined, too consistent. It was a thing, something real, and it was staying in front of her truck no matter what she did. She grabbed her CB radio. "Any drivers on Highway 2 westbound?" Static answered, then a voice, distorted and faint. "The shadow?" Carmen keyed her mic. "Yeah, there's something in my headlights." The voice responded, "Don't try to reach it. Don't get close. It's been on this highway for years." Carmen asked, "What happens if you reach it?" The voice was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know." The transmission ended, leaving Carmen alone with the shadow dancing at the edge of her lights. Carmen tried turning off her headlights. Complete darkness, dangerous on the empty highway. She flipped them back on immediately. The shadow was closer now, just 30 feet ahead, and she could see more details. It had no face, just a blank space where features should be. Its body seemed to be made of darkness deeper than the night around it. A void in the shape of a creature. Carmen slammed on her brakes. The shadow stopped instantly, maintaining its distance. Carmen waited, engine idling, watching the shadow stand motionless in her headlights. Then it began to move again, not forward but side to side, swaying like it was dancing or confused. Carmen put her truck in reverse, backing up slowly. The shadow turned to face her, though it had no eyes, and began moving toward her. Carmen stopped reversing. The shadow stopped advancing. They were at an impasse. If Carmen moved forward, it stayed ahead. If she moved back, it followed. There was no escape. Carmen tried calling 911, but her phone showed no signal despite the display indicating full bars. She tried her GPS, but the screen showed only static, the map corrupted into meaningless patterns. The shadow had cut her off from the outside world. It was just Carmen, the shadow, and the empty Montana highway. Hours passed. Carmen didn't move, and neither did the shadow. Dawn began to break on the horizon. As light spread across the sky, the shadow began to fade. It didn't walk away or disappear suddenly. It just became less defined, less present, until by full daylight it was gone completely. Carmen drove forward cautiously. The highway was empty, normal. She continued to her destination, delivered her load, and tried to convince herself the shadow had been fatigue-induced hallucination. But deep down, she knew better. 3 nights later, Carmen was driving through Wyoming. Different highway, different state. At 3:00 a.m., the shadow appeared in her headlights again. Same distance, same swaying movement, same impossible proportions. Carmen pulled over immediately and waited for dawn. The shadow disappeared with the sunrise. This became Carmen's new reality. Every night drive, regardless of location, the shadow would appear in her headlights around 3:00 a.m. It never got closer unless she reversed. It never fell behind. It just stayed there at the edge of her lights, a dark companion on every night route. Carmen tried different strategies. She drove only during the day, but that limited her routes and income. She tried changing trucks, thinking maybe her vehicle was the problem. The shadow appeared in the new truck's headlights on the first night. She tried driving with no headlights at all, using night vision goggles. The shadow was visible even then, glowing with its own anti-light, a dark spot in her enhanced vision. Other drivers started reporting similar experiences. Carmen reached out to these drivers, comparing notes. They all described the same entity. Humanoid shadow, wrong proportions, appears at night, stays at the edge of headlights. One driver, Marcus, claimed he'd tried to hit the shadow with his truck. I floored it, tried to run it over. When my truck reached where it should be, I passed right through it, like it was a projection. But in my mirror, it was behind me now, following instead of leading. I had to back up to get it in front again. Carmen understood his fear. Having the shadow ahead was unnerving, but knowing it was behind would be worse. At least in front, she could see it. She never reversed, never allowed it to get behind her truck. The shadow stayed ahead and Carmen stayed behind it, a strange convoy of one truck and one impossible creature, traveling America's highways in the small hours before dawn. Researchers became interested. Paranormal investigators, scientists studying mass hallucinations, even military intelligence, looking for unusual phenomena. Carmen agreed to be studied. They put cameras on her truck, measuring equipment, sensors. On the first night drive, the cameras recorded nothing. The sensors detected nothing. But Carmen could see it clearly, the shadow swaying in her headlights. Maybe it's only visible to the driver, one researcher suggested. but other drivers in separate vehicles driving the same route at the same time reported seeing the shadow in their own headlights. It was simultaneously personal and shared, visible to multiple people but not to cameras or instruments. Carmen learned to live with it. The shadow never harmed her, never got closer, just accompanied her night drives like a dark guardian or a sinister escort. She named it Walker, though it didn't walk. The name made it less frightening, more familiar. Years passed. Carmen still drives at night and Walker still appears in her headlights around 3 o'clock a.m. She's learned its patterns. It sways when she's tired, stays still when she's alert, moves faster when storms approach. Walker is a dark barometer reflecting something about the night, the driver, or the highway itself. Carmen has heard theories. Walker is a ghost of a hitchhiker, a demon, an alien, a psychological manifestation, a glitch in reality. She doesn't know which, if any, are true. All she knows is that Walker is there in her headlights every night, staying just ahead, never reaching but never leaving, a shadow companion on the endless highway, reminding her that some things in the darkness are watching back, following those who drive through the night. Visible only in the brief space between headlights and darkness, real but untouchable, always ahead but never left behind. Story 10. The delivery to a town that doesn't exist. The pickup was in Portland, the delivery address was a warehouse in Millbrook, and the pay was standard. Jordan loaded computer equipment and headed south on I-5, then east on Highway 58 toward his GPS-provided destination. The GPS led Jordan onto progressively smaller roads, from highway to rural route to unmarked 2-lane road. Jordan looked around. There was no town, just forest on both sides of the road. He drove slowly, looking for signs of civilization. Nothing. Jordan pulled over and checked his paperwork. The delivery address was definitely Millbrook, Oregon. He pulled up his map app on his phone. Millbrook wasn't listed. He searched online. No results for Millbrook, Oregon. Jordan called his dispatcher. "Hey, I'm at the delivery location, but there's no town here." His dispatcher checked the system. "That's what the client provided. Millbrook, Oregon, 1247 Industrial Way." Jordan looked at the forest around him. "There's nothing here." His dispatcher said she'd call the client and get back to him. Jordan waited, engine idling. As he sat there, a car approached from behind, an old sedan that looked like it was from the 1950s. The car passed him slowly, the driver waving. Jordan watched it drive ahead about a quarter mile, then simply vanish. One moment the car was there, the next it was gone, as if it had driven into invisible air. Jordan's phone rang. His dispatcher. "Okay, I talked to the client. They say Millbrook is definitely there. Just keep following the GPS." End quote. Jordan took a breath and drove forward, following his GPS even though there was nothing to see. The GPS counted down distance, 1 mile, half mile, quarter mile. Jordan looked right, forest. He stopped the truck and climbed down. Standing at the edge of the road, Jordan noticed something strange. The forest looked different at a certain angle. The trees seemed to shimmer slightly like heat waves. Jordan stepped toward the tree line and suddenly the perspective shifted. The forest was gone, replaced by buildings, streets, a whole town that hadn't been visible from the road. Jordan was standing on the edge of Millbrook. The town looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1940s or 50s. Buildings were brick and wood, streets were cobblestone, streetlights were antique gas lamps converted to electric. People walked the sidewalks in outdated clothing. Cars from bygone decades were parked along the streets. Jordan walked back toward his truck, and the town disappeared, replaced by forest. He stepped forward again, and the town reappeared. It was like stepping through a membrane, crossing a boundary between visibility and invisibility. Jordan's truck was parked outside this boundary, visible only as forest to anyone inside Millbrook. and the town was invisible to anyone on the road outside. Jordan returned to his truck, carefully angled it toward the shimmer, and drove slowly forward. As his truck crossed the boundary, the sensation was like passing through water, a moment of resistance. Then he was inside Millbrook, driving on cobblestone streets surrounded by buildings and people, who all stopped to stare at his modern semi-truck. Jordan followed the GPS to the warehouse at 1247 Industrial Way. The warehouse looked like it had been built in the 1930s, all brick and steel. He backed up to the loading dock and workers came out to unload his cargo. They were dressed in period clothing, work overalls and caps that hadn't been fashionable in 70 years. One of the workers, a man named Henry, helped guide Jordan's truck into position. "Don't get many deliveries from outside," Henry said. Jordan asked why. Henry shrugged. "Millbrook has been separate since 1952. Jordan tried to understand. Henry's expression darkened. The town made a choice. There was a threat, something coming. The town council decided to remove Millbrook from normal space, hide it between dimensions or something like that. I don't understand the science, but we've been separate ever since." Jordan's cargo was unloaded quickly. He got the signature for delivery, a physical paper document signed with fountain pen. Henry handed it to him. "You should leave before dark. The boundaries are more stable during the day." Jordan climbed into his truck and tried to leave immediately. He drove through Millbrook's streets, following the GPS back to where he'd entered. But when he reached what should have been the boundary, there was no shimmer, no forest, just more Millbrook streets continuing indefinitely. Jordan tried different routes, but every street just led to more town, as if Millbrook had expanded to trap him. Jordan parked and got out, asking people for directions to the exit. They pointed him in various directions, but none led out. An elderly woman finally explained, "The town doesn't let everyone leave. Sometimes it needs new residents. People come in for deliveries or wrong turns, and Millbrook keeps them. You'll get used to it." Jordan felt panic rising. "I'm not staying here." The woman patted his arm sympathetically. "We all had lives outside. Now we have lives here. Millbrook takes care of its residents." Jordan spent hours driving, trying to find the boundary. Fuel was running low. He stopped at what looked like a gas station from the 1940s. They had diesel, surprisingly, and filled his tank. The attendant, a young man in period uniform, said, "You're the new one? You'll find the exit when Millbrook decides to let you go." Jordan learned that Millbrook had its own economy, its own rules, its own reality, separate from the outside world. People lived full lives here, many of them former travelers who'd been absorbed into the town decades ago. Some had been here since the 1950s, aging slowly or not at all, trapped in a pocket of time and space that didn't sync with the world beyond. Days passed. Jordan lived in his truck parked on a Millbrook street, refusing to accept that he was stuck. He tried everything, driving at different times, walking the town perimeter, even attempting to bulldoze through buildings that should mark the edge. Nothing worked. Millbrook was inescapable. On the 7th day, Jordan woke up and tried one more time. He drove to the northeast corner of town where Henry had said the boundary was weakest. And there it was, the shimmer, barely visible but present. Jordan accelerated toward it, praying the boundary would let him pass. The truck hit the shimmer with that same water-like resistance, but this time the resistance increased. Jordan felt his truck slow, as if driving through molasses. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, engine roaring, truck barely moving. Through his windshield, he could see forest beginning to appear, overlapping with Millbrook's streets. He was between realities and the truck was stuck. Jordan put all his focus into moving forward. Inch by inch, the truck pushed through. The resistance peaked, then suddenly released, and Jordan burst through into the forest on the unnamed road where he'd first found Millbrook. He looked in his mirrors. The town was gone, invisible again. Jordan drove away fast, not stopping until he reached I-5. He called his dispatcher. "Delivery complete." His dispatcher checked the system. "Jordan, according to our tracking, you've been stationary for 7 days." Jordan looked at his clock. 7 days had passed in Millbrook, but he'd only experienced 7 days of consciousness. No time dilation, just 7 real days trapped in a town between dimensions. Jordan filed his report, delivered his signed paper document, and collected his pay. But his company flagged him as unreliable due to the week-long disappearance. Jordan tried to explain, but who would believe him? He showed them the document signed by Henry, dated with a 1950s-era fountain pen. The company dismissed it as a forgery. Jordan quit trucking. The experience had broken something in him. The knowledge that towns could exist invisible to the world, that you could drive through a membrane into a place that trapped people for decades. That reality had boundaries thin enough to cross but hard to recross, but sometimes late at night. Jordan dreams of Millbrook. He sees the cobblestone streets, the period buildings, the people in outdated clothing. And in the dreams he realizes he's still there, that he never left, that his escape was just Millbrook's way of letting him think he'd gotten free, and Jordan wakes up screaming. Unsure if he's in his bed in Portland or still asleep in his truck on a Millbrook street. Dreaming of freedom while trapped forever in a town that doesn't exist on any map. A place between places, waiting for the next delivery driver to cross the shimmer and discover that some deliveries have no return trip. Story 11. The highway that traded memories for miles. Lucas Patterson was driving through South Dakota on I-90 in February 2022 when he noticed the signs. Digital billboards, but not advertising anything. Lucas had never seen billboards like this, and I-90 wasn't known for cryptic advertising. His GPS rerouted suddenly, directing him to take the next exit. Lucas tried to cancel the reroute, but the GPS locked, insisting he take exit 247. Curious and a bit unnerved, Lucas followed the directions. The exit led to a rest area, but not a normal one. This rest area had a large building with no identifying signs, just a symbol. An hourglass with a human brain inside it. Lucas parked and went inside. The building's interior was sterile, white walls, bright lighting, and a single desk with a woman in a business suit. She smiled as Lucas approached. "Mr. Patterson, welcome to the exchange point." Lucas stopped. The woman gestured to a chair. "We know all our clients. You've been selected for an exchange opportunity. Your truck needs fuel, yes? And your route to Chicago is still 847 miles. Lucas sat down cautiously. "Reduce distance?" The woman nodded. "In a manner of speaking. We can remove miles from your journey, make them simply not exist. You'll travel from here to Chicago in a fraction of the distance. No time wasted, no extra fuel consumed." Lucas knew this sounded too good to be true. The woman's smile widened. "Memories. We trade miles for memories. Every 100 miles we remove costs 1 significant memory. To reduce your journey by 600 miles, we require 6 memories. You choose which ones." Lucas laughed nervously. "This is a scam, right?" The woman opened a drawer and pulled out a tablet. She showed Lucas a video, himself graduating high school. Lucas watched his younger self walk across the stage, receive his diploma, hug his parents. The woman's expression was neutral. "We didn't get it. We extracted it from your memory centers and visualized it. We can access all your memories, Mr. Patterson, and we can remove them cleanly, leaving no trace except the absence." Lucas felt sick. The woman explained. "Time is precious, distance is tedious. We offer efficiency at the cost of experiences you've already had. Most people have memories they'd prefer to forget, traumas, embarrassments, painful moments. We can remove those and give you a faster journey." Lucas stood to leave. The woman held up a hand. "Before you go, consider this. Your route to Chicago currently requires crossing a section of I-90 that will be closed in 3 hours due to a severe storm. Blizzard conditions, zero visibility, multiple vehicle accidents. If you don't take our exchange, you'll be trapped in that storm. Lucas checked his weather app. Severe storm warnings for the exact area the woman described, hitting in 3 hours. She was right. Lucas could try to outrun the storm, but he was hauling a loaded trailer. Couldn't speed safely. The woman pulled up a list on her tablet. We typically take happy memories, they're more valuable. Painful memories are low value, not worth the exchange rate. Lucas felt anger rising. Those are my best memories. The woman corrected him. 6 of your best moments. You'll still have many others, and in exchange, you'll avoid the storm, save 10 hours, and reduce fuel costs significantly. Lucas paced the room, thinking. He didn't want to give up any memories, but the storm was real. If he got trapped or crashed, he might not make the delivery at all, might lose his contract, might even lose his life. What if I trade bad memories instead? The woman checked her tablet. We can remove your memory of your father's death. That's worth 50 miles. The car accident when you were 17, that's worth 30 miles. Your divorce, that's worth 80 miles. Total 160 miles removed for your 3 most painful memories. Lucas sat down again, head in his hands. He was trapped. The storm made the choice for him. If I do this, if I trade the 6 happy memories, what happens? The woman stood. She led Lucas to a back room filled with equipment that looked medical and technological combined. A chair sat in the center, surrounded by scanning devices. Sit here. The process takes 15 minutes. You'll feel a slight tingling sensation, then nothing. Lucas sat in the chair. How will I be closer? The woman smiled. Nothing so dramatic. We simply remove the distance from your experience. You'll drive out of this rest area, and within minutes you'll be 600 miles closer to your destination. Lucas asked one more question. The woman's smile faded slightly. We preserve them. Memories are valuable data. They're stored, studied, archived. Lucas felt violated by the idea but nodded. He'd come this far. The woman activated the equipment. Lucas felt tingling throughout his head, then warmth. Then nothing. He woke up in the chair, the woman standing over him. Complete. Lucas stood, feeling normal. The woman handed him a card with a number. 241. You are now 241 miles from Chicago. The distance has been removed. Lucas walked out to his truck, climbed in, and checked his GPS. It showed 241 miles to Chicago. He'd driven approximately 600 miles in the 15 minutes he was in the chair, but he had no memory of the drive. Lucas pulled out of the rest area and back onto I-90. The landscape looked different than he remembered, but he couldn't place how. His GPS showed he was in a part of South Dakota he'd never seen, but he must have driven through it, right? The confusion was disorienting. Lucas drove the remaining 241 miles to Chicago, delivered his load, and returned to his home base. Over the next few days, he noticed the holes in his memory. Friends would reference his prom, and Lucas had no recollection. His CDL license showed a date, but Lucas couldn't remember the test or the pride of passing. Photos on his phone showed events he didn't recognize, gaps in his life where happy moments should be. Lucas tried to remember what he'd traded away, but there was nothing to remember, just an awareness of absence. He'd given up experiences that defined him, and now he was a person with missing pieces. The efficiency of the shorter trip didn't seem worth it anymore. Lucas researched the exchange point, trying to find others who'd made the trade. He found forum posts from drivers describing similar experiences. Memories traded for miles, gaps in their lives they couldn't explain, and the horrible realization that they'd given up their best moments for a shortcut. One post from a driver named Angela explained, I've been to the exchange point 4 times. I've traded away almost all my happy memories. I'm efficient now. My routes are short, but I can't remember why I started driving. Can't remember the people I loved. Can't remember anything that made life worth living. Lucas vowed never to take another exchange, but 6 months later, facing another impossible deadline and another dangerous stretch of highway, he found himself at the exchange point again. The woman welcomed him back. "Mr. Patterson returning so soon?" Lucas has been driving for 3 years since his first exchange. He's made 7 trades now, giving up more memories each time. He's the most efficient driver in his company, completing routes in impossibly short times. But Lucas can't remember his childhood, his family, his wife, or why he became a trucker. His life is just the highway, the deliveries, and the growing awareness that he's traded himself away one memory at a time for miles that don't exist. Driving routes that skip over distance by skipping over his own life. Until eventually there will be nothing left of Lucas Patterson except an efficient driver with no past, no identity. Just an empty man on an endless highway trading the last fragments of who he was for the efficiency of who he's become. Isabella Cruz was driving through West Virginia on Route 119 in June 2020 when she entered a tunnel at 7:45 p.m. The tunnel was short, maybe a quarter mile. Isabella entered at normal speed, expecting to exit within 30 seconds, but when she emerged from the tunnel, everything was different. The sky was wrong. It was still evening, but the clouds were arranged differently, and the sunset was on the wrong side of the horizon. Isabella pulled over, confused. She checked her compass. North was where it should be, but the sunset was in the east, which was impossible. Isabella continued driving, thinking her exhaustion was playing tricks. But as she drove, she noticed other differences. The highway signs were in slightly different positions. Mile markers showed numbers that didn't match her GPS. Buildings she'd passed before the tunnel were gone or replaced with different structures. Isabella's phone rang. She answered. A voice that sounded like hers responded, "Isabella, this is you. I know this sounds insane, but listen carefully. You've crossed into a parallel version of your life. The tunnel is a junction point." Isabella pulled over, hands shaking. The voice sighed. "I'm Isabella Cruz. I'm you, but from the original timeline. I've been tracking the tunnel phenomenon for 2 years. It connects parallel versions of the same highways. When you drive through at certain times, you shift between realities." Isabella looked at her phone. The caller ID showed her own number. The other Isabella's voice was urgent. "I don't have time to convince you. In 20 minutes, the tunnel will shift junctions. If you're not back in your original timeline by then, you'll be stuck in this parallel one. Your life here is similar but different. Different choices, different outcomes. Go back through the tunnel." The call ended. Isabella sat in her truck trying to process. Parallel timelines, different versions of herself. It sounded like science fiction. But the sunset in the east was real. The wrong mile markers were real. Something had changed when she drove through that tunnel. Isabella turned her truck around and headed back toward the tunnel. As she drove, she noticed more differences. A billboard advertised a product that didn't exist in her world. A town name was spelled differently. Small changes but accumulating into wrongness. Isabella reached the tunnel and drove through. When she emerged, the sunset was in the west. The clouds were back to how she remembered. Mile markers matched her GPS again. Relief flooded through her. She'd made it back to her own timeline, her own version of reality. But then Isabella noticed something in her truck, a coffee cup that wasn't hers. It was the same brand she used, but a flavor she never bought. She picked it up, confused. Her phone rang again. Different voice this time, also female, also familiar. "Isabella?" Isabella's blood ran cold. The voice explained, "I'm Isabella Cruz. I was driving through the tunnel on Route 119, and when I came out, I was in your truck. You must be in my timeline now." Isabella looked around her truck. Everything seemed normal except the coffee cup. The other Isabella laughed bitterly. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of Isabella Cruzes, all driving trucks, all crossing through that tunnel at different times. We keep switching places, living each other's lives in slightly different worlds. Isabella felt panic rising. The other Isabella's voice was resigned. You don't. You learn to adapt. Your life here is probably 95% the same as your original. Slight differences. Maybe you have a different friend, maybe your truck is a different color, maybe your favorite food is something else. But you're still Isabella Cruz, still a trucker. Isabella refused to accept this. She drove through the tunnel again. Different reality. Again. Another parallel world, again and again, each time emerging into a slightly different version of her life. After the 7th crossing, Isabella couldn't remember what her original life had been like. The details blurred together. Different coffee preferences, different routes, different people with slightly altered names or relationships. Isabella met other versions of herself by making calls to her own number. They formed a network, Isabella's scattered across parallel timelines, all trying to find their way home, but none able to confirm which timeline was the original. They shared information about the tunnel, about other junction points they'd found, about the rules of parallel shifting. One Isabella, who'd been shifting for 5 years, explained the theory. The tunnel doesn't create parallel timelines. They already exist. The tunnel just lets us cross between them. Every choice we've ever made created a branch. There's a timeline where you became a teacher, one where you never learned to drive, one where you died as a child. Isabella asked if there was a way to stop shifting, to lock into one timeline. The experienced Isabella replied, avoid the tunnel. Never drive through it again. Eventually, you'll settle into whichever timeline you're in, and it'll become your reality. The memories of other timelines will fade. But Isabella couldn't avoid the tunnel. Her regular routes went through it, and every time she drove through, she shifted to another parallel world. She started keeping a journal, noting the differences in each timeline, trying to find patterns. In some timelines, her mother was alive, in others, dead. In some, she was married, in others, single. Small variations that accumulated into vastly different lives. The shifting began to affect Isabella's mental state. She couldn't maintain relationships because people were subtly different in each timeline. Her friend Maria might be supportive in one world, hostile in another. Her dispatcher might be friendly or dismissive. Isabella never knew which version of people she'd encounter. Worst were the timelines where Isabella herself had made different choices. She entered one timeline where her parallel self was an alcoholic, the truck a mess, the life falling apart. Isabella spent a week in that timeline, trying to fix the other Isabella's mistakes before shifting again. She entered another timeline where her parallel self was successful, wealthy, happy. Isabella spent a month in that timeline, enjoying the better life before shifting took her to a darker world. Isabella realized she was living fractured across dozens of lives, never settling, never stable. The tunnel had made her existence quantum. She was all Isabella's simultaneously, her identity spread across parallel worlds, and the worst part was knowing that in other timelines, other Isabellas were living better or worse lives, and she was just one possibility among many. Isabella tried to destroy the tunnel, but it was invulnerable to damage. She tried to block it off, but construction crews would clear any barriers overnight. The tunnel existed as a permanent junction, shifting travelers between parallel lives whether they wanted to shift or not. 3 years later, Isabella has stopped fighting it. She drives through the tunnel regularly, accepting whichever timeline she emerges into. She's learned to adapt quickly, to assess which version of her life she's entered, to adjust her behavior to match. She's been rich Isabella, poor Isabella, happy Isabella, depressed Isabella. She's lived countless variations of her own life. And sometimes, late at night in whatever truck stop she's sleeping in, Isabella wonders if she even has an original timeline anymore. Maybe she's just a consciousness bouncing between parallel versions, a quantum driver who exists in superposition, living all possible lives simultaneously but experiencing them one at a time. The tunnel made her infinite, but also unmoored, forever crossing between worlds, unable to stay in any single life long enough to call it home, driving an endless route through parallel highways in parallel worlds, knowing that somewhere, in some tunnel, another Isabella is entering, about to discover that her life is just one variation among many, and that once you start shifting, you can never truly stop, never truly settle, just shift forever between infinite versions of yourself, all living the same roads through different realities, all alone together in the maze of parallel lives.